In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a scandal rocks the harvest feast. 6 rare speckled eggs, the pride of Mrs. Harrow's farm, vanish from a locked milking shed. Was it a thief in the night, or a rival's cunning plot? Enter Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unravelling clue do's, untouched sheen, a lanolin-scented scarf, a hidden basket that pointed betrayal close to home. As the clock ticks toward the contest, secrets unravel, and justice stirs in the shadows. Who stole the eggs, and why? In St. Mary Mead, nothing is as it seems. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Prize. The village of St. Mary Mead lay hushed under a crisp October moon, its thatched roofs silvered by frost. In the cozy nook of the Blue Boar, the village's sole public house, a fire crackled, casting shadows across the low-beamed ceiling. Villagers gathered, their voices a warm hum, discussing the morrow's harvest feast, a tradition as old as the church spire. This year, the feast's culinary contest had stirred uncommon excitement, for the prize was no mere ribbon. Mrs. Harrow, a farmer's widow with a sharp eye and sharper tongue, had offered a clutch of rare speckled eggs from her prized hens. Birds descended, it was whispered, from stock once kept at Chatsworth. These eggs, with yolks like molten gold, were the envy of every cook from here to Upper Tilling. At a corner table, Miss Jane Marple sat, her slight figure wrapped in a lavender shawl, her hands cradling a cup of chamomile tea. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, her silver hair tucked beneath a neat cap, her blue eyes mild behind spectacles. But those who knew her hand in St. Mary Mead all did understood that Miss Marple's mind was as keen as her knitting needles, which lay idle in her lap tonight. She listened, as she always did, to the ebb and flow of village talk. Mrs. Bantry, the Colonel's wife, was lamenting the scarcity of good plums. Young Dr. Haydock was teasing the barmaid about her suitors, and Mr. Pye, the fussy antique dealer, was boasting of a new teapot he'd acquired. But it was the contest that dominated. With speculation rife about who might claim Mrs. Harrow's eggs, they're locked safe in the milking shed, declared Mrs. Harrow herself, who had swept into the pub an hour earlier, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She stood by the bar, a formidable figure in her tweed coat, fielding questions with the air of a general. My hens lay nothing finer, and I'll not have them pilfered before dawn. The winner takes the lot for their dish, and mark my words, it'll be a dish fit for royalty. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the window. The milking shed, she knew, stood at the edge of Harrow Farm, a stout building of weathered oak and stone. It was an unlikely target for theft, yet something in Mrs. Harrow's defiant tone stirred her curiosity. People, Miss Marple had long observed, protested loudest when they feared the very thing they denied. She recalled a similar incident years ago in Little Weeshwood, when a silver cup vanished before a fete. The culprit, a choir boy with sticky fingers, had been undone by his own boastful mother. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Villagers, she thought, were much alike. Her musings were shattered by a commotion at the door. It burst open, admitting a gust of chill air and a panting figure gem, Mrs. Harrow's farmhand, his cap askew, his boots caked with mud. Mrs. Harrow, he gasped, his voice cutting through the din. The eggs, they're gone, stolen, clean out of the shed. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the pop of a log in the fire. Mrs. Harrow's face drained of colour. Gone, she echoed, her voice a dangerous whisper. What nonsense is this, Jem? You locked that shed yourself. I did, Ma'am, I swear it. Jem's eyes were wide, his hands wringing his cap. Checked it at 10, all secure. But I went back just now to fetch a lantern, and the basket's empty. Door was ajar, not a soul about. The pub erupted. Voices overlapped in outrage and disbelief. Thieves in St. Mary Mead, cried Mrs. Bantry, clutching her pearls. Gypsies, I'll wager, muttered Mr. Pye, his teapot forgotten. Dr. Haydock called for calm, but it was Constable Reed, a lanky young man who'd been nursing a pint, who took charge. I'll see to this, he said, pulling on his coat. Jem, show me the shed. Mrs. Harrow, stay here till we know more. Miss Marple set down her tea, her mind already turning. An empty basket, a door ajar, and a theft under cover of darkness. It was a puzzle, and puzzles, she knew, were solved by details. She rose, her movements deliberate, and addressed Constable Reed. If I may, Constable, I'd like to see the scene myself. A fresh pair of eyes, you know. Her tone was mild, but there was a glint in her eye that read, new to the village, did not yet recognize. Reed hesitated, then nodded. Very well, Miss Marple, but mind the cold. Mrs. Harrow, still reeling, barely noticed as Miss Marple followed. The men out into the night, her shawl drawn tight against the frost. The moon hung low, lighting their path to Harrow Farm, where the milking shed loomed, its door swinging faintly in the breeze. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Something about that door, she thought, was not quite right. And in St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in plain sight, she knew better than to trust first impressions. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The night air bit at Miss Jane Marple's cheeks as she followed Constable Reed and Jem. The farmhand, down the frost-slick path to Harrow Farm. The moon, a pale disk, veiled by wisps of cloud, cast long shadows. Across the fields, where sheep huddled in silent clusters, St. Mary Mead, so tranquil by day, seemed to hold its breath under the weight of this unexpected crime. Miss Marple, her lavender shawl drawn tight, leaned lightly on her ebony stick, its tap against the ground a steady counterpoint to Jem's nervous chatter. I don't understand it, miss, he was saying, his breath puffing in the cold. Locked. It myself I did, not 2 hours gone. Who dare nick eggs from Mrs. Harrow? Constable Reed, striding ahead with a lantern, grunted. We'll see soon enough, Jem. Keep your wits about you. His voice, though firm, betrayed a hint of unease. Reed was young, newly posted to the village, and a theft of this nature-rare speckled eggs no less was a far cry from settling disputes over straying hens or stolen apples. Miss Marple, trailing behind, noted his brisk pace and wondered if it masked a lack of confidence. Young men, she reflected, often hurried when uncertain, much like her nephew Raymond's friend who'd once mislaid a manuscript and dashed about London to hide his panic. They reached Harrow Farm, its stone walls looming against the night sky. The milking shed stood apart from the farmhouse, a sturdy structure of weathered oak and flint, its pitched roof sagging slightly with age. The door, as Jem had described, hung ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. Reed raised his lantern, its golden beams slicing through the darkness, revealing the shed's interior. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her sharp eyes taking in every detail before stepping inside. She had learned, over many years of quiet observation, that the first glimpse of a scene often held truths later overlooked. The shed was spacious, its air thick with the earthy scent of hay and the faint musk of livestock. To the left, a row of milking stools lined the wall, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. Opposite, a wooden bench held an assortment of tools buckets, a coiled rope, a tin of liniment for the cows. In the center of the bench sat the empty basket, its woven wicker gleaming faintly under the lantern's glow. It was a simple thing, unadorned, yet its emptiness seemed to mock the night's purpose. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, noting the absence of straw or cloth that might have cushioned the eggs. "How many were there, Jem?" she asked, her voice gentle but precise. "6, Miss Jem replied, hovering near the door. "Mrs. Harrow counted M herself this evening. Finest eggs you ever saw, speckled like a thrush's breast." His hands twisted his cap, betraying his agitation. "She'll have my hide for this." Reed, crouching by the door, examined the lock. "No signs of tampering," he muttered, running a finger along the iron latch. "Jem, you're sure you bolted it?" "Swear on me mother's grave, sir," Jem said earnestly. "Checked it twice, like always. Mrs. Harrow don't abide carelessness." Miss Marple, moving slowly, approached the bench. The basket's placement struck her as deliberate, centered as if on display. She leaned closer, her spectacles catching the lantern light, and noticed a faint smudge on the bench's edgier. Trace of dirt, perhaps, or grease. It was too small to signify much, but she filed it away, her mind already weaving possibilities. People, she knew, left traces as surely as snails left slime, and this smudge might yet speak. Reed, rising, turned, his attention to the floor. The dirt was packed hard, scuffed by countless boots, but near the bench, a set of tracks stood out, clear and deep. "Cow tracks," he said, pointing. "Fresh, by the look of M. Lead right out the back." He swung the lantern toward the shed's rear, where a narrow door led to the pasture. Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting the track's path. They were bold, almost too perfect, their edges crisp in the dry earth. "Curious," she murmured, "for a cow to wander through a shed at night." Jem scratched his head. "Ain't right, that cows are in their stalls by dusk, bolted in. I saw to it myself." Reed frowned, crossing to the back door. It was unlatched, swinging easily when he pushed it. Beyond lay the pasture, its grass silvered by moonlight. The tracks continued, veering toward a wooden fence some 20 yards distant. Reed stepped outside, his lantern bobbing, and beckoned Jem. "Show me where they go." Miss Marple remained inside, her attention drawn to the fence visible through the open door. Something glinted on one of its posts, catching the lantern's stray light. She moved closer, her stick tapping softly, and saw it, a scrap of fabric snagged on a splintered rail. "Constable," she called, her voice calm but insistent, "you might wish to see this." Reed returned, Jem trailing, and held the lantern high. The fabric was a ragged scarf, its wool coarse and patched, its edges frayed. It smelled faintly of lanolin, the sharp tang of sheep. Reed plucked it free, turning it over in his hands. "Not one of Mrs. Harrow's," he said, "too rough. For her lot, gypsies may be passing through." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. She studied the scarf, noting its size large enough to cloak a face or bundle something small, like eggs. Its presence on the fence suggested haste, a thief caught unawares. Yet the tracks, the open door, the scarfall seemed too convenient, like props in a village pageant. She recalled a case in Chipping Cleghorn, where a dropped glove had led the police astray, its owner laughing all the way to freedom. "We mustn't assume too much," she added softly. Reed, undeterred, pocketed the scarf. I'll take this. To the station. Jem, you stay here. Keep the shed locked till morning. Miss Marple, I'll walk you home, it's late. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. Thank you, Constable, but I'd like a moment more, if I may. The air clears the mind. Reed hesitated, then nodded, promising to return after checking the pasture. Jem, relieved to have a task, scurried to fetch a padlock from the farmhouse. Alone, Miss Marple circled the shed's interior, her gaze methodical. The hay bales, stacked high in the corner, caught her attention. They were neatly arranged, their edges aligned, yet one bale seemed slightly askew, its straw protruding. She reached out, her fingers brushing the coarse fibers, but did not disturb it. Not yet, she thought. Timing was everything. Outside, the night was still, save for the distant bleat of a sheep. Miss Marple stepped into the pasture, her stick sinking slightly into the frosted grass. The cow tracks, illuminated by moonlight, stretched toward the fence, but she noted their depth, too heavy for a cow wandering idly, almost as if guided. She approached the fence, her eyes scanning the ground. The grass was undisturbed, its dew glistening unbroken. No human footprints marred its sheen, despite the scarf's implication of a fleeing thief. How very strange, she murmured, her mind racing. Reed's lantern reappeared, bobbing as he returned. Tracks stop at the fence, he reported, his breath clouding. Nothing beyond but sheep grazing. Whoever took those eggs knew the land slipped away clean. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. So it seems, Constable. But her thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the night's oddities, the unforced door, the pristine basket, the deliberate tracks, the scarf's convenient snag. Each was a thread, and threads she knew could unravel even the cleverest knot. She recalled a long-ago incident at her friend Mrs. Clement's vicarage, where a stolen brooch had been found not by searching, but by noticing a maid's Towiga alibi. People, Miss Marple mused, were their own undoing. Jem returned, brandishing a padlock. "This'll keep Em out, miss," he said, securing the back door. Reed, satisfied, offered Miss Marple his arm. "Let's get you home, then. I'll have men search the woods at dawn." She accepted, her grip light but steady. As they walked back to the village, the milking shed fading into the dark, Miss Marple's mind churned. The theft was no random act. It had purpose, perhaps tied to the contest's prestige or the London contract rumoured to await the winner. Mrs. Harrow's rival, Mr. Finch, came to mind, a boastful man with his own flock, whose eggs had never matched hers. And Jem, so quick. To swear his diligence, had he been too quick. Then there was the scarf, its lanolin scent hinting at a sheephand, like Tom Gable, who worked both farms. She tucked these thoughts away, her face betraying nothing. At her cottage gate, Reed tipped. His helmet? "Rest easy, Miss Marple. We'll have those eggs back by noon." "I'm sure you will, Constable," she replied, her smile kind but enigmatic. She entered her home, the fire's embers glowing softly, and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The milking shed, she knew, held more than it had revealed. The tracks, the scarf, the hay bales each, was a clue, but clues were only half the story. The other half lay in people, their motives and missteps. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and unerring eye, was already watching where the shadows fell. Chapter 3. The search party forms the first light of dawn crept over St. Mary Mead, painting the thatched roofs with a delicate flush of pink. The village, usually stirring slowly with the clink of milk bottles and the chatter of early risers, was already abuzz with the news of the stolen eggs. By 6 o'clock, a crowd had gathered outside the Blue Boar, their voices a low, indignant hum. The theft of Mrs. Harrow's speckled eggs, those jewels of the Harvest Feast's culinary contest, was no mere mischief. It was an affront to the villagers' pride. The air crackled with speculation, and every tongue wagged with theories, from gypsies to jealous rivals to, in one wild whisper, a fox with uncommon cunning. Miss Jane Marple, standing at her cottage window, watched the gathering with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her lavender shawl was draped over her shoulders, and a cup of tea steamed in her hands, its fragrance mingling with the scent of her garden's late roses. She had risen early, as was her habit, her mind already turning over the events of the night. The milking shed, with its unforced door, its empty basket, and those curiously deliberate cow tracks, had left her with a puzzle that refused to settle. The ragged scarf, snagged on the fence, and the pristine dew beyond it only deepened her suspicion that the theft was not what it seemed. She sipped her tea, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles, and recalled a similar stir in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a silver teapot vanished from the vicarage. The culprit, a seemingly guileless gardener, had been undone by a single overlooked detail, a smudge of polish on his cuff. Details, Miss Marple knew, were the key to unlocking secrets. Outside, the crowd swelled, spilling onto the cobbled lane. Mrs. Harrow stood at its centre, her tweed coat buttoned to her chin, her face a storm of fury and determination. "I'll not have my good name dragged through the mud," she declared, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "Those eggs were my pride, and some scoundrels made off with them. I demand a search, Constable Reed, and I demand it now." Her stout frame seemed to expand with each word, and the villagers nodded, their outrage echoing hers. The Harvest Feast was hours away, and without the eggs, the contest would be a hollow affair. Constable Reed, looking harried in his hastily donned uniform, raised his hands for silence. "We'll find your eggs, Mrs. Harrow," he said, his tone more hopeful than certain. "I'm organizing a search party to comb the woods and fields. Whoever took them can't have gone far." He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Tom Gable, the sheephand, who lounged against a lamppost, his wiry frame clad in a patched jacket. Tom's face, weathered by years in the fields, broke into a quick smile. "I'll lead the way, Constable," he offered, stepping forward. "Saw a cloaked figure last night, slipping toward the western woods round midnight. Looked suspicious, if you ask me." The crowd turned to him, their interest piqued. Tom, known for his tales as much as his skill with sheep, straightened under their gaze. "Couldn't see their face," he continued, "but they moved fast, like they knew the land. I'd wager they're hiding out in the thickets by Miller's Brook." His words sparked a fresh wave of murmurs, and several men nodded, eager to act. Miss Marple, watching from her window, noted the ease with which Tom spoke, his voice carrying a touch too much confidence. She had known men like him charming, quick to volunteer, and often hiding more than they revealed. A memory surfaced of a young curate in her youth, whose eagerness to help had masked a penchant for pocketing collection coins. Mrs. Bantry, bustling up the lane with her husband's old shooting stick, joined the throng. "A cloaked figure," she exclaimed, her eyes wide. "It's like something out of a novel. We must search at once." Her enthusiasm, as always, was infectious, and soon a dozen villagers, farmers, shopkeepers, and even young Dr. Haydock, who'd abandoned his morning rounds, volunteered for the search. Reed, clearly relieved to have support, began assigning tasks. Tom, you take the lead to the woods. Mr. Pye. You and Dr. Haydock check the eastern fields. Mrs. Bantry, perhaps you'd organize some tea for when we return. Miss Marple, setting down her tea, decided it was time to join the fray. She donned her best hatter, sensible affair, with a single feather and stepped into her garden, her stick tapping lightly. By the time she reached the crowd, Reed was finalizing plans. He spotted her and tipped his helmet. Miss Marple didn't expect you out so early. Care to join the search? We could use your sharp eyes. She smiled, her expression mild, but her mind alert. Thank you, Constable, but my rheumatism forbids long walks. I'll sit by the farm, if I may, and keep an eye on things. An observer, you know, can be useful. Reed nodded, accustomed to her quiet ways, and turned back to the group. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of merely sitting. She made her way to Harrow Farm, settling on a bench outside the milking shed, her knitting bag at her side. From here, she could see the search party disperse, Tom Gable leading a group toward the western woods with a purposeful stride. His eagerness, she thought, was worth watching. The farm was quiet now, save for the cluck of hens and the distant lowing of cows. Mrs. Harrow, too agitated to join the search, paced nearby, muttering about thieves and ruined reputations. Miss Marple, her needles clicking rhythmically, listened as Mrs. Harrow vented. It's that Finch, she spat, naming her rival, a pompous farmer whose own hens were the talk of Upper Tilling. He's been green with envy since my eggs won last year. I wouldn't put it past him to stoop to theft. Miss Marple nodded, sympathetically, her mind elsewhere. Mr. Finch was indeed a possibility. His boasts at the pub had been loud and frequent, but motive alone was not enough. She recalled the cow tracks in the shed, their depth suggesting intent, and the scarf, its lanolin scent hinting at a shepherd's hand. Tom Gable, she knew, worked for both Mrs. Harrow and Mr. Finch, his loyalty divided by the promise of coin. His tale of a cloaked figure, so conveniently timed, felt rehearsed, like a line from one of Raymond's theatrical friends, and the dupe, undisturbed beyond the fence, suggested no one had fled that way at all. As the search party vanished into the distance, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the milking shed. Its door, now padlocked by Jem, stood firm, but her thoughts returned to the hay bales inside. Their neat arrangement had struck her as odd last night, one bale slightly askew, as if moved in haste. She considered entering the shed, but decided against it. The morning's bustle would make such a move conspicuous. Instead, she turned to Elsie, the dairymaid, who was sweeping the yard nearby. Elsie, my dear, Miss Marple called, her voice soft but clear. Might you tell me about last night's milking? Were the cows all settled before dark? Elsie, a sturdy girl with freckled cheeks, paused her broom. Aye, miss. Locked M in by 6, like always. Mrs. Harrow checks the stalls herself. Don't trust no one else. She hesitated, then added, Jem was here till late, though. Fussing with the shed. Said he was fixing a hinge. Miss Marple's needles paused. A hinge. How industrious of Jem. Her tone was kind, but her mind raced. Jem's diligence, like Tom's tale, seemed too convenient. She recalled a maid in Dannemouth who'd fixed a window to cover her theft of a bracelet. And Tom Gable, she continued, was he about the farm last night? Elsie frowned. Didn't see him, miss. He's usually with the sheep, not the cows. But he's always poking about, ain't he? Says it's his job to know the land." She resumed sweeping, her broom kicking up dust. Miss Marple thanked her, her thoughts turning to Tom. His role as sheephand gave him free rein over the fields, and his knowledge of the farm's nooks and crannies was unmatched. If he'd planted the scarf or guided a cow through the shed, he'd have known exactly where to place each clue. The sun climbed higher, warming the bench where Miss Marple sat. She watched the farmyard come to life, hens scratching, a cart rumbling past, Mrs. Harrow still pacing. The search party's absence left the village oddly quiet, and Miss Marple used the moment to reflect. The theft, she sensed, was no random act. The eggs' value lay not just in their rarity but in the prestige they conferred. A prize that could secure a lucrative contract with a London restaurant. Mr. Finch, with his own flock, stood to gain if Mrs. Harrow faltered. But Tom Gable, she suspected, was the key. His quick offer to lead the search, his tale of a cloaked figure, these were not the actions of an innocent man. She thought of a poacher in her youth, whose alibis had been as smooth as Tom's, until a single feather betrayed him. Mrs. Bantry appeared, her shooting stick tapping the path. "Jane," she called, bustling over. "You're missing all the excitement. They're scouring the woods now, led by that Gable fellow. He's certain the thief's hiding there." She sank onto the bench, fanning herself. "Though I must say, it's all very thrilling. Like one of those detective stories Colonel Bantry reads." Miss Marple smiled. "Thrilling, indeed, Dolly. But I wonder if the woods are the right place to look." Her tone was light, but her eyes were keen. Mrs. Bantry, catching the glint, leaned closer. "You've got that look, Jane. What are you thinking?" "Nothing definite," Miss Marple replied, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Only that people often point where they wish others to go, rather than where the truth lies." She said no more, but her mind was busy, weaving the threads of the night's clues. The cow tracks, the scarf, the hay bales, Tom's tale, pointed to a carefully laid plan, and Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and unerring instinct, knew that the truth was closer than the western woods. It was here, in the farm's shadows, waiting for her to unravel it. Chapter 4. The dew's silent testimony. The sun rose higher over St. Mary Mead, its rays piercing the morning mist that clung to the fields like a gossamer veil. Harrow Farm, usually a bustle of activity by this hour, lay under a pall of unease. Its milking shed now the centre of the villagers' collective indignation. The theft of Mrs. Harrow's speckled eggs had stirred a hornet's nest, and the search party, led by Tom Gable toward the western woods, had left the farmyard quiet, save for the occasional cluck of hens and the creak of a distant gate. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench outside the shed, her knitting needles clicking softly, appeared to all the world as a harmless old lady enjoying the morning air. But her blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing, and her mind was far from idle. The events of the night replayed in her thoughts with the clarity of a well-rehearsed play. The milking shed's unforced door, the empty basket, the deep cow tracks leading to the fence, and the ragged scarf snagged on a splintered postal were pieces of a puzzle that refused to align. Tom Gable's tale of a cloaked figure fleeing toward the woods had sent the search party on what Miss Marple suspected was a wild goose chase. She had seen such diversions before, in the case of a missing pearl necklace in Lower Barton, where a butler's vivid account of a stranger had kept the police chasing shadows while the pearls lay hidden in a teapot. People, she knew, often wove tales to conceal their own tracks, and Tom's eagerness to lead the search struck her as a thread worth tugging. She rose from the bench, her ebony stick tapping the ground, and began a slow circuit of the farmyard. The grass, still heavy with dew, sparkled under the rising sun, its surface unbroken save for the paths trodden by the search party. Miss Marple's gaze followed the cow tracks from the shed's back door to the wooden fence, where the scarf had been found. The tracks were bold, their edges sharp in the dry earth, suggesting a heavy beast deliberately led. But beyond the fence, where Tom claimed his cloaked figure had fled, the grass told a different story. The dew lay pristine, its delicate sheen undisturbed by any footfall, human or otherwise. Not a blade was bent, not a drop displaced. "How very curious," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustle of her shawl. No one passed. "This way last night." She paused, her mind turning over the implications. If no one had crossed the fence, then Tom's story was a fabrication, or, at the very least, a misdirection. She recalled a similar discrepancy in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a stolen bicycle was said to have been ridden across a meadow, yet the grass showed no sign of disturbance. The culprit, a grocer's boy, had been undone by his own overconfidence. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Nature, she thought, was a truthful witness, and the dew's silent testimony spoke louder than Tom's tale. Returning to the shed, she found Mrs. Harrow in conference with Elsie, the dairymaid, who was recounting the previous evening's routine for the third time that morning. "I locked the cows in by 6, ma'am," Elsie was saying, her freckled face earnest. "Checked every stall, like you told me. No one could have got in without a key." Mrs. Harrow, her hands on her hips, looked unconvinced, her eyes darting. To the shed, as if expecting the eggs to reappear by sheer force of will, Miss Marple approached, her expression one of gentle inquiry. "Elsie, my dear," she said, "you're quite sure the cows were secure? No chance one might have wandered into the shed later?" Her tone was mild, but her question was precise, designed to probe without alarming. Elsie shook her head vigorously. "Not a chance, miss. The stalls are bolted tight, and I'd hear if one got loose. They're not quiet beasts, cows." She glanced at Mrs. Harrow, who nodded grudgingly. "Elsie's right," Mrs. Harrow said. "My herd's well trained, and the stalls are sturdy. Those tracks in the shed are nonsense, someone's playing tricks." Her voice trembled with indignation, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of fear in her eyes. The loss of the eggs was more than a blow to her pride. It threatened her reputation and the lucrative London contract that hung on the contest's outcome. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting back to the shed. "Indeed, Mrs. Harrow, tricks are often at the heart of such matters." She excused herself and resumed her circuit, her stick tapping a slow rhythm. The cow tracks, she reasoned, were no accident. Someone had led a cow through the shed, to create the appearance of a chaotic theft, perhaps to suggest a clumsy intruder or a beastly mishap. But the track's clarity and the absence of other marks, human footprints, scuffs, or signs of a struggles, suggested a careful hand. She thought of Tom Gable, whose work with sheep gave him access to the farm's animals, and whose knowledge of the land was unmatched. Could he have borrowed a cow from the stalls, led it through the shed, and returned it before dawn? The idea was plausible, but it required confirmation. She made her way to the cow stalls, a low stone building adjacent to the shed. The air inside was warm, heavy with the scent of hay and manure. The cows, chewing placidly, paid her no mind as she examined the stalls. Each was secured with a heavy bolt, as Elsie had said, and the floor was clean. swept daily to Mrs. Harrow's exacting standards. But near the end stall, Miss Marple noticed a faint scattering of dirt, not unlike the soil in the shed. It was a small detail easily overlooked, but to her it was as telling as a shout. Someone had moved a cow recently, and not during the usual milking hours. She filed the observation away, her mind weaving it into the growing tapestry of clues. As she emerged from the stalls, she spotted Jem, the farmhand, carrying a bucket of feed. His cap was pulled low, and his shoulders hunched, as if the weight of the theft rested on him alone. "Jem," she called softly, "a moment, if you please." He started, nearly dropping the bucket, and approached with a wary look. "Yes, miss," he said, his voice tight. "I ain't got much time, missus. Harrow's got me running all over." "I shan't keep you," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I was only wondering about the shed's lock last night. You checked it twice, you said. Did you notice anything odd, perhaps a sound, or someone nearby?" Jem's eyes flickered, and he shifted his weight. "Nothing, miss. All quiet, save for the sheep bleating. I locked the shed at 10, like I told the constable, and went straight home." His words were quick, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush creeping up his neck. She had seen such signs before, in a shopgirl who'd sworn she hadn't touched a till, only to be caught with coins in her apron. Jem, she suspected, knew more than he was saying. "Thank you, Jem," she said, her tone unchanged. "You've been most helpful." As he hurried off, she watched him go, her thoughts turning to his role. Jem's access to the shed made him a potential accomplice, but his nervousness suggested fear rather than guilt. Was he covering for someone else? Tom Gable, perhaps, or even Mr. Finch, whose rivalry with Mrs. Harrow was the talk of the village. She recalled a case in Much Benham, where a nervous footman had been pressured into silence by a domineering master. Pressure, she knew, could twist even the most honest heart. The farmyard was growing busier now, with villagers returning from the early search efforts, their faces flushed with exertion but empty-handed. Mrs. Bantry, her shooting stick planted firmly in the ground, approached Miss Marple with a dramatic sigh. "Jane, it's hopeless. They've scoured the woods and found nothing, not a footprint, not a trace. That Gable fellow swears his cloaked figure is out there, but I'm beginning to think he imagined it." She sank onto the bench, fanning herself with a handkerchief. "What do you make of it? You've got that look again." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her expression serene. "I'm not sure, Dolly," she said, "but I find the do most interesting. It tells us where people haven't been, you see." She said no more, but Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, sensing the weight behind her friend's words. Miss Marple's mind, however, was elsewhere, piecing together the morning's discoveries. The undisturbed dew beyond the fence contradicted Tom's story, suggesting the thief had never left the farm. The cow tracks, the dirt in the stalls, and Jem's unease pointed to a plan hatched close to home. And the scarf, with its lanolin scent, hinted at someone familiar with sheep's. Someone like Tom, who moved freely between farms. She glanced at the milking shed, its padlocked door a silent challenge. The hay bales inside, she recalled, had seemed oddly arranged, one slightly askew. Could the eggs be hidden there, the theft a ruse to discredit Mrs. Harrow? The idea was bold, but not impossible. She thought of a similar trick in Chipping Cleghorn, where a stolen brooch had been hidden in a flower pot, its thief hoping to retrieve it later. The eggs, she reasoned, might be closer than anyone thought, and the search party's absence gave her an opportunity to investigate. Rising, she excused herself to Mrs. Bantry and approached the shed, her stick tapping softly. The padlock was new, its key likely with Jem or Mrs. Harrow. She had no intention of breaking in. Such actions were for younger, brasher souls, but she circled the shed, her eyes scanning for anything amiss. Near the back door, she noticed a small pile of straw, scattered as if swept from inside. It was a minor detail, but to Miss Marple, it was another thread in the tapestry. Someone had been careful, but not careful enough. As she returned to her bench, the search party began trickling back, their voices loud with frustration. Tom Gable, at their head, looked flushed but undeterred. "Nothing yet, miss," he called to her, his smile a touch too bright. "But we'll keep at it. The thief's out there somewhere." Miss Marple nodded, her expression polite, but her mind racing. Tom's confidence, like Jem's unease, was a clue in itself. She settled back on the bench, her knitting resumed, and watched as the village churned with activity. The truth, she knew, was not in the woods, but here, in the farm's quiet corners, waiting for her to unravel its secrets. Chapter 5. The scarf's tailed, the morning sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across Harrow Farm's yard, where the air still buzzed with the village's indignation over the stolen speckled eggs. The search party, led by Tom Gable, had returned from the western woods empty-handed, their boots muddied and their tempers frayed. The milking shed, now a symbol of the village's wounded pride, stood silent under its new padlock, its secrets locked within. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench outside the shed, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, appeared to be merely knitting, her needles clicking with a rhythm as steady as a metronome. But her blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, were alert, scanning the farmyard for the smallest hint of truth in the morning's chaos. Her thoughts were occupied with the clues of the night before. The unforced door, the empty basket, the deliberate cow tracks, and the ragged scarf snagged on the fence post. The dew's untouched sheen beyond the fence had already cast doubt on Tom Gable's tale of a cloaked figure fleeing to the woods, and the faint scattering of straw near the shed's back door had deepened her suspicion that the theft was a carefully staged affair. But it was the scarf, with its coarse wool and faint lanolin scent, that held her attention now. It was an object out of place, a deliberate clue that seemed to point away from the farm, yet its very presence suggested a closer connection. Miss Marple had seen such misdirection before, in the case of a missing cameo brooch in Upper Tilling, where a dropped handkerchief had led the police to a vagrant's camp, only for the true thiefer parlourmaid to be revealed by her own nervous fidgeting. Objects, she knew, could lie as surely as people, but they also whispered truths to those who listened. She rose from the bench, her ebony stick tapping lightly, and made her way toward the farmhouse, where Mrs. Harrow was holding court with a small knot of villagers. The widow's voice carried across the yard, sharp with frustration. "It's a disgrace," she declared, her hands planted on her hips. "My eggs, the finest in the county, stolen like common apples. I'll have the law on whoever did this. Mark my words." The villagers nodded, their murmurs a chorus of agreement, though Miss Marple noted a few sceptical glances. Mrs. Harrow's pride in her hens was legendary, but so was her rivalry with Mr. Finch, whose own flock had long been overshadowed by hers. The London contract at stake in the harvest feast's contest had only sharpened the edge of their competition. Miss Marple approached, her smile gentle, but her purpose firm. "Mrs. Harrow," she said, "might I trouble you for a word about that scarf the constable found? It's such an odd thing to be left behind." Her tone was deferential, as if seeking gossip rather than evidence, a tactic she had perfected over years of quiet inquiry. Mrs. Harrow turned, her eyes narrowing. "That rag, no doing of mine, Miss Marple, too coarse for my household. Likely some tramps dropped in their hurry to make off with my eggs." She gestured toward the fence where the scarf had been found, her indignation undimmed. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her gaze drifting to the fence. "It's curious, though, how it caught on the post, almost as if meant to be seen." She left the thought hanging, her expression serene, and excused herself to visit Mrs. Crump, the village seamstress, whose cottage lay a short walk down the lane. If anyone could shed light on the scarf's origins, it was Mrs. Crump, whose needle had mended half the village's wardrobe. The seamstress's cottage was a cosy affair, its windows framed with lace curtains and its garden a riot of late asters. Mrs. Crump, a wiry woman with fingers nimble as a sparrow's, welcomed Miss Marple with a cup of tea and a plate of homemade biscuits. "Heard about the eggs, I have," she said, settling into a chintz-covered chair. "A fine to-do, ain't it? What's this about a scarf, then?" Miss Marple produced the scarf, which Constable Reed had entrusted to her for safekeeping, wrapped in a clean handkerchief. She unfolded it carefully, revealing its patched, coarse weave and the faint whiff of lanolin. "Found on the fence at Harrow Farm," she explained. "I wondered if you might recognize the work." Mrs. Crump peered at the scarf, her eyes narrowing as she turned it over. "Not local, I'd say," she pronounced after a moment. "The wool's cheap, spun rough, and the patches are clumsied on by someone with more haste than skill. Could be a tramp's, or someone from the hills, where they don't fuss with fine stitching." She sniffed it, wrinkling her nose. "Smells of sheep, don't it? Lanolin, clear as day. Whoever wore this spent time with ewes." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The lanolin scent was no surprise, but Mrs. Crump's assessment confirmed her suspicion that the scarf was linked to someone who worked with sheeps, someone like Tom Gable, whose days were spent herding flocks across both Harrow and Finch farms. She recalled his weathered jacket, its pockets often bulging with odds and ends, and wondered if the scarf might have come from one. "Thank you, Mrs. Crump," she said, tucking the scarf back into her bag. "You've been most helpful." As she returned to the farm, the village was stirring with renewed activity. The search party had dispersed, some to their homes, others to the pub to speculate over pints. Tom Gable, however, lingered near the shed, chatting with a group of farmers. His easy manner and quick smile drew nods and laughter, but Miss Marple, watching from a distance, noted a certain watchfulness in his eyes. He was a man who played his part well, she thought, much like the charming curate in her youth who'd dazzled the parish while pilfering from the poor box. She settled back on her bench, her knitting resumed, and let her mind wander over the scarf's tale. The lanolin scent was a clue, but not a definitive one. Many in St. Mary Mead worked with sheep, and a scarf could be dropped by accident. Yet, its placement on the fence, so conspicuous, suggested intent. Had Tom left it to bolster his story of a fleeing thief? Or was it a misstep, a careless discard meant to be retrieved later? She thought of the cow tracks, their depth indicating a deliberate act, and the dew's pristine sheen, which contradicted Tom's claim of a chase to the woods. The scarf, she reasoned, was part of a larger design, a thread meant to lead the village astray. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who swept into the yard with her usual gusto, her shooting stick tapping the ground. "Jane," she exclaimed, plopping onto the bench. The search was a fiasco, nothing but brambles and tired feet. That Gable fellow's still banging on about his cloaked figure, but I'm not sure I believe him. He's too eager, don't you think? She leaned closer, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "You're up to something, I can tell. What's that scarf you were waving about?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing. "Just a bit of cloth, Dolly, but it tells a story. Whether it's the one Mr. Gable wants us to hear, I'm not certain." She recounted her visit to Mrs. Crump, omitting no detail, and watched Mrs. Bantry's face light up with intrigue. "Sounds like something out of one of Colonel Bantry's thrillers," Mrs. Bantry said. "A scarf, cow tracks, a locked shed, it's all so mysterious. Do you think it's that Finch, trying to ruin Mrs. Harrow? Everyone knows he's desperate to win the contest." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was busy. Mr. Finch was indeed a suspect. His rivalry with Mrs. Harrow fueled by the promise of a London contract. But Tom Gable's role troubled her more. His quick offer to lead the search, his vivid tale of a cloaked figure, and now the scarf's lanolin sentinel pointed to a man with something to hide. She recalled a case in Little Weeshwood where a gamekeeper's dropped pipe had led to his undoing, its tobacco matching a stash found at the crime scene. Small things, she knew, could unravel great deceptions. The farmyard grew busier as noon approached, with villagers returning to gossip and speculate. Constable Reed appeared, his face drawn from a morning of fruitless inquiries. "No luck, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his helmet. "The woods are empty, and the fields are clear. I'm starting to think those eggs are long gone." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But I wonder, Constable, if you've considered the scarf's owner. It smells of sheep, you know, and not many in the village handle use as often as Mr. Gable." She spoke lightly, as if sharing a passing thought, but Reed's eyes sharpened. "Tom Gable," he said. "He's been helpful, leading the search and all, but I'll have a word with him. That scarf's our best clue." He strode off, his lantern swinging, and Miss Marple watched him go, her needles clicking once more. She had planted a seed, and Red, she trusted, would water it. But her own suspicions ran deeper, to the hay bales in the shed, the scattered straw, and the possibility that the eggs were never far from the farm. As the sun reached its zenith, Miss Marple rose, her stick tapping a determined rhythm. She would return to the shed tonight, when the village slept, to test her theory about the hay bales. The scarf's tale was not yet complete, but it had pointed her toward Tom Gable, and she sensed he was the key to unlocking the theft's true purpose. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in plain sight, Miss Marple knew that the smallest thread could unravel the tightest knot, and she was ready to pull it. Chapter 6. A motive emerges. The midday sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, softening the edges of Harrow Farm's stone walls and lending a deceptive calm to the village's simmering unrest. The theft of Mrs. Harrow's speckled eggs, those rare treasures destined for the harvest feast's culinary contest, had set tongues wagging from the butcher's shop to the post office. The milking shed, now a focal point of suspicion, stood quiet under its padlock, its weathered oak door a silent witness to the night's misdeeds. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more on her bench outside the shed, her lavender shawl neatly arranged, appeared absorbed in her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the farmyard's hum. But her mind was far from the shawl, taking shape in her lap. It was weaving a tapestry of clues, each thread drawn from the morning's observations and the village's ever-flowing gossip. The scarf, with its coarse wool and lanolin scent, had deepened her suspicion of Tom Gable, the sheephand whose tale of a cloaked figure had led the search party astray. The undisturbed dew beyond the fence had exposed his story as a likely fabrication, and the cow tracks in the shed, too deliberate for a wandering beast, suggested a staged scene. The faint scattering of straw near the shed's back door and the misaligned hay bale inside hinted that the eggs might still be close, hidden to discredit Mrs. Harrow. But why? Miss Marple's blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the yard where villagers milled, their voices a low buzz of speculation. Motive, she knew, was the heart of any crime, and in St. Mary Mead, motives were as tangled as the ivy on the churchyard wall. She rose, her ebony stick tapping lightly, and made her way to the village hall, where the harvest feast preparations were in full swing. The hall, a sturdy building of red brick, was alive with activity. Women arranged tables with crisp linens. Men hauled baskets of apples and pumpkins, and children darted underfoot, pilfering biscuits from unguarded trays. The culinary contest, the feast's crowning event, was the topic of every conversation, its prestige heightened by the promise of a contract to supply eggs to a fashionable London restaurant. Miss Marple slipped inside, her presence as unremarkable as a sparrow, and settled near the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, who was overseeing the flower arrangements with her usual brisk efficiency. "Such a to-do about those eggs," Mrs. Price said, spotting Miss Marple. "Mrs. Harrow's in a state, and who can blame her? Those speckled beauties were her trump card. Though I must say, Mr. Finch has been awfully smug, boasting his hens could outdo hers any day." She snipped a rose stem with a touch too much force, her lips pursed. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "Mr. Finch, you say? I've heard he's quite proud of his flock." Her tone was mild, but her question was deliberate, designed to draw out the village's undercurrents without stirring suspicion. "Oh, proud's not the half of it," Mrs. Price said, warming to the topic. "He's been strutting about like a peacock, telling anyone who'll listen that his eggs are just as fine as Mrs. Harrow's, if not finer. Says the London contract should be his by rights. And you know, Jane, he's not wrong to want it. That contract's worth a pretty penny, enough to keep a farm afloat for years." She lowered her voice, glancing about. "I heard from Mrs. Crump that Tom Gable owes Finch a tidy sum, something about a bad wager on the races. Been working extra shifts to pay it off, poor lad." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her face betrayed no surprise. Tom Gable, in debt to Mr. Finch. How unfortunate. Her mind raced, fitting this new piece into the puzzle. A debt could bind a man as surely as chains, and Tom's loyalty, already split between Harrow and Finch farms, might easily be swayed by the promise of relief. She recalled a case in Chipping Cleghorn, where a debt-ridden clerk had pilfered ledgers to please his creditor, only to be caught by a stray ink stain. Loyalty, she thought, was a fragile thing, easily bought or sold. She thanked Mrs. Price and moved to a table where Mrs. Bantry was arranging a display of jams, her usual exuberance tempered by the morning's fruitless search. "Jane," she exclaimed, waving a jar of raspberry preserve, "this village is positively agog. Everyone's got a theory about those ex-gypsies, tramps, even old Mrs. Wimpole's cat. If you believe Mr. Pye, but I say it's Finch. He's been far too pleased with himself, and you know how he loathes Mrs. Harrow. She set the jar down with a thud, her eyes gleaming. What do you think? You've been awfully quiet, which means you're onto something. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting resumed. I'm only listening, Dolly, but I do wonder about motives. The contest is more than a matter of pride, isn't it? A contract with London is no small prize. She spoke lightly, but her words were a probe, testing the waters of Mrs. Bantry's gossip. Oh, it's a fortune, Mrs. Bantry said, leaning closer. Mrs. Harrow told me the restaurant's offering a year's supply contract, paid in advance. Enough to buy new stock, mend fences, even hire extra hands. Finch wants it badly, says his farm's been struggling since the drought. And Tom Gable, well, he's been seen at Finch's place more than usual, hauling feed and mending gates. Odd, don't you think, for a sheephand to be so chummy with his rival's master? Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her thoughts aligning. Tom's frequent visits to Finch's farm, coupled with his debt, painted a picture of a man under pressure. Had Finch offered to erase the debt in exchange for a favour, say, the theft of Mrs. Harrow's eggs? The idea was plausible, but it required more than supposition. She recalled the scarf, its lanolin scent linking it to sheep, and Tom's role. A sheephand made him a natural suspect. But the cow tracks puzzled her. Why use a cow when a sheep would have been simpler for Tom to manage? The answer, she suspected, lay in misdirection, a ploy to confuse the trail. She excused herself and returned to Harrow Farm, where the yard was quieter now. The villagers dispersed to their midday meals. Mrs. Harrow stood near the shed, berating Jem for some minor oversight, her voice carrying across the yard. Miss Marple approached, her stick tapping softly, and waited until the widow's tirade subsided. Mrs. Harrow, she said, might I ask about Tom Gable? I understand he works for both you and Mr. Finch. Has he been reliable of late? Mrs. Harrow's eyes narrowed, her suspicion flaring. Tom, he's a good hand with sheep, I'll give him that, but he's been distracted lately. Always rushing off to Finch's place, claiming extra work. I don't trust him, Miss Marple, not since I caught him loitering near the shed last week. No reason given. She folded her arms. Her face set. You think he's mixed up in this? I think nothing yet, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, but it's wise to know where loyalties lie. She thanked Mrs. Harrow and returned to her bench, her mind churning. Tom's presence near the shed, his debt to Finch, and his tale of a cloaked figure were threads in a tightening knot. She thought of a young gardener in her youth, whose debts had led him to steal a silver tray, his guilt betrayed by a trembling hand. Tom, she suspected, was trembling beneath his easy smile. The afternoon wore on, and the village hall grew busier as the harvest feast neared. Miss Marple, declining an invitation to judge the pie contest, lingered at the farm, her eyes on the shed. She had resolved to inspect the hay bales tonight when the village slept. But her thoughts now turned to Mr. Finch. His motive was clear discredit to Mrs. Harrow. Win the contract, but his involvement was less certain. Had he orchestrated the theft or merely exploited Tom's desperation? She recalled a case in Much Benham where a rival baker had paid a delivery boy to sabotage a rival's oven, only to feign innocence when the bread burned. Men like Finch, she knew, often hid behind others' hands. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, Constable Reed appeared, his face weary from a day of inquiries. No news, Miss Marple, he said, pausing by her bench. The search turned up nothing, and the scarf's a dead end. Mrs. Crump says it's not local. I'm starting to think those eggs are halfway to London by now." Miss Marple looked up, her expression mild. "Perhaps, Constable. But I wonder if we've looked too far afield. Mr. Finch, for instance, has he been questioned about his movements last night?" Her question was gentle, but Reed's eyes sharpened. "Finch, he was at the Blue Boar till late, according to the barmaid. But I'll have a word. And Tom Gable, too, Heath, been mighty helpful. But that debt Mrs. Price mentioned makes me wonder." Reed tipped his helmet and moved off, his lantern swinging. Miss Marple watched him go, satisfied that her nudge had taken root. Reed was young, but he was learning, and she trusted him to follow the trail. She settled back, her knitting resumed, and let her mind wander. The motive was clearer now. Finch's ambition, fueled by the London contract, and Tom's debt, a lever. To bend his will, the scarf, the cow tracks, the hay bales, were parts of a plan to discredit Mrs. Harrow, perhaps to hide the eggs until the contest passed. But Tom's role was the key, and Miss Marple resolved to watch him closely. She thought of a poacher in Little Weeshwood, whose alibi had crumbled under the weight of a single feather, and knew that Tom's confidence would betray him in time. As the afternoon faded into evening, the farmyard grew quiet, the villagers returning to the hall for the feast's opening ceremonies. Miss Marple rose, her stick tapping a determined rhythm, and made her way home to rest before her planned nighttime visit to the shed. The motive had emerged, but the truth was still hidden, waiting for her to unravel its final threads. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets lurked in every shadow, Miss Marple was ready to shine a light. Chapter 7. The Sheephand's Tale. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a warm, amber light across Harrow Farm's fields, where the sheep grazed in placid clusters. The village, still reeling from the theft of Mrs. Harrow's speckled eggs, had settled into a restless hum, with the harvest feast's preparations at the village hall drawing most of its residents. The milking shed, now a symbol of intrigue, stood quiet under its sturdy padlock, its secrets guarded by the weathered oak door. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to her bench outside the shed after her inquiries at the village hall, sat with her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her knitting needles moving with a soft, rhythmic click. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying the fading light, but her blue eyes, keen behind her spectacles, were fixed on the farmyard, where every movement told a story. Her morning had been fruitful, weaving a tighter net around Tom Gable, the sheephand, whose actions grew increasingly suspect, the scarf's lanolin scent, the deliberate cow tracks, and the undisturbed dew beyond the fence had already cast doubt on his tale of a cloaked figure fleeing to the western woods. The revelation of his debt to Mr. Finch, Mrs. Harrow's rival, had provided a motive, suggesting Tom might have been coerced into stealing the eggs to sabotage the contest. The faint scattering of straw near the shed's back door and the misaligned hay bale inside hinted that the eggs might still be hidden on the farm. A theory Miss Marple planned to test tonight, but first she needed to hear Tom's story again, to probe its seams for the truth. People, she knew, often betrayed themselves in the retelling, like the housemaid in Lower Barton who'd tripped over her own alibi about a stolen bracelet. The farmyard stirred as the search party straggled back, their faces etched with fatigue and frustration. Tom Gable led the group, his wiry frame moving with a purposeful stride, his weathered jacket flapping as he gestured animatedly to the men behind him. His voice carried across the yard, buoyant despite the lack of results. "Nothing yet, lads. But we'll find that thief. Those woods are thick, plenty of places to hide. The men nodded, though their enthusiasm had waned, and they soon dispersed. Some to the farmhouse for tea, others to the Blue Boar for something stronger. Tom lingered, catching sight of Miss Marple on her bench. He tipped his cap, his quick smile flashing. "Afternoon, Miss. No luck yet, but we're not giving up." Miss Marple returned his smile, her expression mild but her mind alert. "You've been most diligent, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice gentle. "Won't you sit a moment? An old lady likes a bit of news, and I'm curious about that cloaked figure you saw." Her invitation was disarming, framed as idle curiosity. But it was a calculated move to draw him out. Tom hesitated, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second, then pulled up a crate and sat, his elbows resting on his knees. "Not much to tell, miss," he began, his tone easy but his eyes watchful. "Was checking the sheep last night, round midnight, when I saw this figure by the shed. Cloaked, like I said, moving fast toward the woods. Couldn't see their face. Dark, but they knew the land, slipping through the shadows like a fox. I gave chase, but they were gone by Miller's Brook." He leaned back, his hands spread, as if to say that was all there was. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her gaze fixed on her knitting, but her attention wholly on Tom. His story was smooth, almost rehearsed, yet it lacked the small human details that mark a genuine recollection. She recalled a young poacher in her youth, whose tale of a stolen pheasant had been similarly polished, until a stray feather in his cap betrayed him. "How very intriguing," she said, her tone encouraging. "And you were near the shed at midnight. That's late for checking sheep, isn't it?" Tom's smile tightened, though he recovered quickly. "Aye, miss, but lambs can wander, and I don't like leaving 'em to chance. Mrs. Harrow's particular about her stock." He shifted on the crate, his fingers tapping his knee, a small gesture that Miss Marple noted as a sign of unease. "Quite commendable," she said, her eyes lifting briefly to meet his. "And the figure, was it tall, short, perhaps carrying something? Eggs are delicate, after all." Her question was gentle, but it carried a subtle edge, testing the consistency of his account. Tom's eyes flickered, and he rubbed his neck. "Couldn't say, miss. Too quick, and the moonlight wasn't much help. Didn't see no basket, though." He laughed, a touch too loudly, and stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "Best get back to work. Mrs. Harrow'll have my hide if I slack off." Miss Marple nodded, her smile unchanged. "Of course, Mr. Gable. Thank you for indulging an old lady's curiosity." As he strode off, his cap pulled low, she watched him go, her mind racing. Tom's story was flimsy, its details too vague to withstand scrutiny. The dew's pristine sheen beyond the fence had already disproved his claim of a chase, and his presence near the shed at midnight was too convenient. She thought of the scarf, its lanolin scent tying it to sheep, and wondered if Tom had dropped it deliberately to bolster his tale. The cow tracks, she suspected, were his doing as well. A clumsy attempt to suggest a chaotic theft. But why hide the eggs, if that was his plan? The answer, she sensed, lay in Mr. Finch's ambition and Tom's debt. She rose, her stick tapping softly, and made her way to the Blue Boar, where the search party stragglers had gathered. The pub was warm, its low beams glowing under the flicker of oil lamps, and the air thick with the scent of ale and pipe smoke. Miss Marple slipped inside, her presence barely noticed amid the clamour, and settled in a corner near the fire, her knitting bag at her side. The barmaid, a cheerful girl named Polly, brought her a cup of chamomile tea, and Miss Marple thanked her with a smile, her eyes scanning the room. Tom Gable stood at the bar, a pint in hand, regaling a group of farmers with his tale of the cloaked figure. His voice was louder now, emboldened by the ale, but his story remained unchanged. A shadowy figure, a swift escape, a fruitless chase. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her ears attuned to the conversation. One farmer, a burly man named Ted, clapped Tom on the shoulder. "You're a right bloodhound, Tom. If anyone catches that thief, it'll be you." The others laughed, but Miss Marple noted a slight stiffening in Tom's posture, as if the praise sat uneasily. She recalled a case in Much Benham, where a thief's boastful demeanor had masked a growing panic, his lies unraveling under the weight of too many retellings. Tom, she suspected, was nearing that point. She beckoned Polly over, her voice low. "Polly, my dear, you were here last night, weren't you? Did you see Mr. Gable at all, perhaps on his way to check the sheep?" Her question was casual, framed as village gossip, but it was a deliberate probe. Polly frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Tom, not after closing. Miss B was here till 10, drinking with Mr. Finch, then left. Didn't see him again till this morning, when he was all fired up about that cloaked figure." She shrugged, moving off to serve another customer, but her words struck a chord. Tom's claim of checking sheep at midnight was now in question, as was his meeting with Finch. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind fitting this new piece into the puzzle. If Tom hadn't been at the farm until later, his story was not just a misdirection but a lie, crafted to cover his own movements. The pub grew noisier as more villagers arrived, their talk dominated by the theft and the upcoming feast. Miss Marple listened, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, and gleaned further scraps of gossip. Mr. Finch, it seemed, had been at the pub until late, his mood jovial as he toasted his hen's prospects. His rivalry with Mrs. Harrow was no secret, and his recent troubles a failing pump, a drought-stricken pasture, made the London contract a lifeline. Tom's debt to Finch, whispered by several patrons, was common knowledge, and his extra work at Finch's farm was seen as a desperate bid to settle it. Miss Marple thought of a young clerk in her youth, whose debts had led him to forge a cheque, his guilt betrayed by a trembling pen. Tom, she sensed, was similarly instructed, his loyalty to Mrs. Harrow sacrificed for Finch's coin. She finished her tea and rose, her stick tapping a steady rhythm as she left the pub. The evening air was cool, the village settling into the quiet anticipation of the feast. Miss Marple made her way back to Harrow Farm, her thoughts on Tom's tale and its inconsistencies. His vague description of the cloaked figure, his presence at the shed, and his meeting with Finch all pointed to a man with something to hide. The scarf, she reasoned, was likely his, dropped to suggest an outsider's hand, while the cow tracks were a clumsy attempt to muddy the trail. The hay bales, she suspected, held the eggs, hidden to ensure Mrs. Harrow's disgrace. But proof was needed, and Miss Marple planned to find it tonight, under cover of darkness. As she reached the farm, she found Constable Reed speaking with Mrs. Harrow, his notebook in hand. He spotted Miss Marple and tipped his helmet. "Evening?" "Miss Marple, just checking on Tom Gable's story. Seems he was at the pub with Finch till 10, not out with the sheep. Makes me wonder about that cloaked figure." His tone was thoughtful, and Miss Marple nodded, pleased that her earlier nudge had taken root. "Indeed, Constable," she said, her voice mild. "Stories have a way of shifting, don't they? I trust you'll keep an eye on Mr. Gable." She excused herself, and returned to her bench. Her knitting resumed as the farmyard darkened. Tom's tale had unravelled, its threads leading back to Finch and the promise of a cleared debt. The motive was clear, the method nearly so, but the egg's hiding place remained her final quarry. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in plain sight, Miss Marple knew that the truth was close, waiting for her to pull its final thread. Chapter 8. The hay bale's secret. The twilight settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft indigo cloak, its edges tinged with the last glimmers of the setting sun. Harrow Farm, now quiet after the day's clamour, lay bathed in the hush of evening, its fields stretching into shadow. The milking shed, a silent sentinel at the farm's edge, stood locked and dark, its secrets guarded by the sturdy padlock Jem had fastened that morning. The village, preoccupied with the harvest feast's opening festivities at the hall, had left the farmyard deserted, save for the occasional bleat of a sheep or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to her cottage to rest, now stood at her garden gate, her lavender shawl drawn tight against the evening chill. In her hand she held her nephew Raymond's flashlight, its weight reassuring as she prepared for a clandestine visit to the shed. Her blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, gleamed with purpose. For tonight she intended to test her theory about the hay bales and the hidden eggs. The day's inquiries had tightened the net around Tom Gable, the sheephand whose tale of a cloaked figure had crumbled under scrutiny. The undisturbed dude beyond the fence had exposed his story as a lie, and his debt to Mr. Finch, coupled with his late-night presence at the shed, painted him as a likely culprit. The scarf's lanolin scent, the deliberate cow tracks, and the scattered straw near the shed's back door all pointed to a carefully staged theft, designed to discredit Mrs. Harrow and secure the London contract for Finch. But the hay bales, one slightly askew, had lingered in Miss Marple's mind since her first visit to the shed. Their neat arrangement seemed too deliberate, a facade hiding something more. She recalled a case in Dannymouth where a stolen locket had been concealed in a flower bin, its thief banking on the police's haste to overlook the obvious. The eggs, she suspected, were closer than anyone thought, and tonight she would find them. She set out, her ebony stick tapping softly on the cobbled lane, the flashlight tucked into her bag. The village was alive with the distant hum of the feast laughter. Music, the clink of glasses, but the farm lay beyond the revelry, its silence a stark contrast. Miss Marple moved with the quiet assurance of one accustomed to going unnoticed, her slight figure blending into the shadows. She had learned, over years of quiet observation, that darkness was a friend to those seeking truth, for it stripped away pretense and revealed what daylight hid. Harrow Farm loomed ahead, its stone walls silvered by moonlight. The milking shed stood apart, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of years. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the yard, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The cows were in their stalls, the hens roosting, and even Jem, the farmhand, was likely at the feast, drowning his worries in ale. Satisfied that she was alone, she approached the shed's back door, where the cow tracks and the scarf had been found. The padlock gleamed in the moonlight, its presence a challenge, but Miss Marple had no intention of breaking in. She had brought a hairpin, a trick learned from a mischievous maid in her youth, but she hoped to avoid such measures. Instead, she circled the shed, her flashlight's beam low and discreet, searching for any clue overlooked in the morning's bustle. The straw she had noticed earlier, scattered near the back door, caught her eye again. It was sparse, almost deliberate, as if swept from inside to suggest activity. She knelt, her joints protesting, and examined it closely. The straw was fresh, its golden hue unweathered, and a few strands bore traces of dirt that matched the shed's floor. Interesting, she murmured, her mind racing. Someone had been inside recently, perhaps moving the hay bales to conceal their work. She rose, her stick steadying her, and turned her attention to the shed's small window, set high in the wall. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a child, but its latch was old, its wood warped. She reached up, her fingers deft despite her age, and found the latch loose, easily nudged aside with her hairpin. The window creaked open, admitting a draught of cool air. Miss Marple hesitated, aware of the impropriety of her actions, but her resolve was firm. The eggs, she believed, were inside, and the truth was worth a moment's indiscretion. She shone the flashlight through the gap, its beam cutting through the shed's darkness. The milking stools, the bench with its empty basket. The tools all were, as she remembered, but the hay bales in the corner drew her focus. They were stacked high, their edges too neat, except for one bale, its straw protruding like an untidy seam. She angled the beam, noting a faint shadow beneath it, a gap that suggested something hidden. Climbing through the window was out of the question. Her rheumatism forbade such acrobatics, but the shed's interior was now within her reach. She leaned in, her flashlight steady, and examined the bales more closely. The misaligned bale was lower than the others, its base pressed against the wall, but a small hollow was visible beneath it, lined with straw. Her heart quickened. "There you are," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She reached through the window, her arm just long enough to brush the bale's edge, and felt something solid beneath the straw-woven basket, its shape unmistakable. She withdrew, her breath catching, and closed the window, securing the latch as she found it. The eggs were there, hidden under the hay bales, just as she had suspected. The theft was no theft at all, but a ruse to delay the contest and ruin Mrs. Harrow's chances. She thought of Tom Gable, his debt to Finch, and his convenient tale of a cloaked figure. The scarf, the cow tracks, the straw were his handiwork, designed to mislead. But the egg's hiding place was a bold move, one that required nerve and knowledge of the farm. She recalled a case in Upper Tilling where a stolen painting had been hidden in a barn loft, its thief hoping to retrieve it after the search died. Tom, she reasoned, had planned something similar, perhaps intending to find the eggs himself and claim a hero's reward. She stepped back, her flashlight off, and stood in the moonlight, her mind piecing together the final threads. The egg's discovery would expose Tom's deception, but she needed to catch him in the act to ensure justice was served without room for denial. Confronting him now would be premature. He was too clever to admit guilt without proof. She decided to wait, to watch him at the feast, where ale and bravado might loosen his tongue. Her plan formed, she turned to leave, but a rustle in the nearby bushes stopped her cold. She froze, her stick gripped tightly, her senses alert. A figure emerged, not from the bushes, but from the path leading to the farmhouse gem, his cap askew, his steps unsteady from the feast's libations. "Who's there?" he called, his voice thick with suspicion and ale. Miss Marple stepped into the moonlight, her smile disarming. "Only me, Jem," she said, her tone gentle. "I couldn't sleep and thought a walk might do me good. The farm's so peaceful at night, don't you think?" Jem blinked, his suspicion fading. "Aye, miss, but you shouldn't be out alone. Dangerous, with thieves about." He swayed slightly, his bucket clanging against his leg. Just checking the cows. Mrs. Harrow's orders. Of course, Miss Marple said, her eyes noting his flushed cheeks and unsteady gait. You're a dutiful lad. Tell me, did you see Mr. Gable at the feast? He's been so busy with the search. Her question was casual, but it was a probe, testing Jem's knowledge of Tom's movements. Jem scratched his head, frowning. Tom, he was at the pub earlier, boasting about that cloaked figure. Didn't see him at the hall, though. Probably off with Finch, planning their next move. His words slurred slightly, and he clapped a hand over his mouth, as if realizing he'd said too much. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind seized on the slip. Planning, you say? Well, men do love their schemes. Good night, Jem. She turned, her stick tapping softly, and made her way back to the village, her heart light with the confirmation she needed. Jem's unguarded remark, fueled by ale, had linked Tom to Finch more firmly than before. The egg's hiding place, the scarf, the cow traxall were part of a plan orchestrated by Finch, with Tom as his willing pawn dot. As she reached her cottage, the distant strains of the feast's music floated through the night. She paused at her gate, her flashlight tucked away, and considered her next move. Tomorrow she would invite Tom for tea, a quiet setting to probe his story further. His debt to Finch, his presence at the shed, and now the hidden eggs formed a chain of evidence. But she needed his confession to close the case. She thought of a young footman in Chipping Cleghorn, whose nervous laughter had betrayed his theft of a silver spoon, and knew that Tom's confidence would be his undoing. Inside, she lit a single lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The hay bale's secret had confirmed her suspicions, but the truth required one final step. In St. Mary Mead, where shadows hid the deepest secrets, Miss Marple was ready to bring them to light, one careful thread at a time. Chapter 9. A Quiet Confrontation. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, its golden rays piercing the mist that draped the village in a delicate shroud. Harrow Farm, now the epicentre of the village's intrigue, lay quiet after the previous night's revelations, its fields stretching into the distance like a patchwork quilt. The milking shed, with its weathered oak door and sturdy padlock, stood as a silent witness to the theft of Mrs. Harrow's speckled eggs, those rare prizes of the harvest feast's culinary contest. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her cottage's breakfast table, sipped her tea, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders. The events of the night, her discovery of the eggs hidden beneath the hay bales, Jem's unguarded remark about Tom Gable and Mr. Finch, and the deepening web of deceit had left her with a plan as clear as the morning light. Today she would confront Tom Gable, not with accusations, but with the quiet pressure of her insight, a method she had honed over years of unraveling village secrets. Her visit to the shed under moonlight had confirmed her suspicions. The eggs were not stolen, but hidden. A ruse to discredit Mrs. Harrow and secure the London contract for Finch. The scarves lanolin scent, the deliberate cow tracks, the undisturbed dew beyond the fence, and Tom's flimsy tale of a cloaked figure all pointed to the Sheephand as the culprit, acting under Finch's influence. Jem's ale-fueled slip about, Tom planning with Finch, had tightened the net. But Miss Marple knew that proof required more than clues, it required a confession. She recalled a case in Little Wishwood, where a young groom's theft of a saddle had been exposed, not by evidence, but by his own faltering words under gentle questioning. People, she knew, crumbled when their lives were met with kindness, and Tom Gable, with his quick smile and uneasy eyes, was ripe for such an approach. She rose, her ebony stick tapping softly, and penned a note to Tom, inviting him to tea at her cottage that afternoon. The message was polite, almost deferential, praising his diligence in the search and expressing an old lady's curiosity about the farm's workings. She entrusted the note to Polly, the barmaid, who promised to deliver it at the Blue Boar, where Tom was likely nursing a pint. With that done, Miss Marple donned her best hatter, sensible affair, with a single feather, and made her way to the village hall, where the harvest feast's preparations were reaching a fever pitch. The hall buzzed with activity. Women polished, silver men arranged benches, and children darted about, their laughter mingling with the scent of fresh-baked bread. The contest, now hours away, loomed large, its outcome uncertain without the eggs. Miss Marple slipped inside, her presence as unremarkable as a shadow, and settled near Mrs. Price, who was fussing over a display of chrysanthemums. "Jane," Mrs. Price said, spotting her, "the village is in an uproar. Mrs. Harrow's threatening to withdraw from the contest, and Mr. Finch is all but crowing. Says his eggs will win by default." She snipped a stem with a touch too much vigor, her lips pursed. "It's a shame, really. Those speckled eggs were her pride." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "A shame, indeed. I hear Mr. Finch has been quite confident. Has he mentioned anything about the theft?" Her question was casual, but it was a probe, designed to draw out the villagers' gossip without stirring suspicion. Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Not a word about the theft, but he's been thick as thieves with Tom Gable. Saw them yesterday at Finch's farm, heads together over a fence. Looked like they were plotting, if you ask me." She straightened, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of scandal. "And Tom's been jumpy, hasn't he? Always looking over his shoulder, like he's expecting trouble." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, would have clicked faster had she been knitting. "How observant you are, Mrs. Price," she said, her tone warm. "Tom does seem under strain. Perhaps the search has taken its toll." She excused herself and moved to a table where Mrs. Bantry was arranging a pyramid of apples, her usual exuberance undimmed by the morning's tension. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, waving an apple, "this village is a cauldron of gossip. Everyone's pointing fingers, Finch, tramps, even poor Jem, though he's too dim to steal anything but a pie. But I say it's Finch, with Tom Gable doing his dirty work. What do you think? You've got that look again." She set the apple down, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "I'm only listening, Dolly. But I do wonder about precious debts. For instance, can make a man do strange things." She said no more, but Mrs. Bantry's nod suggested she understood. Miss Marple's mind, however, was on Tom's debt to Finch, a lever that had likely bent his will. She recalled a case in Upper Tilling, where a debt-ridden footman had stolen a candlestick to settle a gambling debt, his guilt betrayed by a nervous twitch. Tom, she suspected, was similarly ensnared, his loyalty to Mrs. Harrow sacrificed for Finch's promise. She returned to her cottage, where she prepared for Tom's visit. The parlour was cosy, its chintz curtains drawn to admit the soft light, and a fire crackled in the hearth. She set out her best china, a delicate pattern of roses, and baked a batch of scones, their aroma filling the room. Such touches, she knew, disarmed even the wariest guest, creating a space where truth could slip through the cracks of pretense. She thought of a young curate in her youth, whose confession to pilfering from the poor box had come over tea, his guard lowered by her quiet kindness at 3 o'clock, A knock sounded at the door. Tom Gable stood on the threshold, his cap in hand, his weathered jacket patched at the elbows. His quick smile was in place, but his eyes were guarded, flicking past her to the parlour. "Afternoon, miss," he said, his voice easy but tinged. "With caution, got your note. Mighty kind of you to invite me." "Come in, Mr. Gable," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "An old lady enjoys company, and you've been so busy with the search." She ushered him to a chair by the fire, pouring tea with a steady hand. The scones, slathered with clotted cream and jam, sat invitingly on the table, and Tom, after a moment's hesitation, took one. His manners polite but stiff. They chatted lightly at first about the weather, the feast, the sheep's health. Miss Marple's questions were gentle, her tone that of a curious neighbour, but each was a step toward her goal. "You must know the farm so well," she said, sipping her tea. "All its nooks and crannies, where a lamb might hide something else." Her eyes met his, bright and unyielding, and she saw a flicker of unease. "Miss," Tom said, his scone half-eaten. "Been working these fields for years. Nothing much escapes me." He laughed, but it was forced, and his fingers tapped the arm of the chair. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "And last night, near the shed, such a strange time. To be about, I suppose the sheep keep you busy at all hours." Her voice was soft, but the question was a probe, testing the seams of his story. Tom's smile tightened, and he set down his cup. "Like I said, miss, lambs wander. Had to check him, didn't I? Saw that cloaked figure, like I told the constable." His words were quick, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush creeping up his neck. "Of course," she said, her tone soothing. "Though the dew was so heavy last night, wasn't it? Not a mark beyond the fence, I hear. Strange, for someone fleeing to the woods." She paused, letting the words settle, and watched his face. Tom's eyes flickered, and his hand stilled on the chair, a telltale sign of nerves. "Do," he said, his voice a touch too high. "Didn't notice, miss, too dark, and I was in a hurry." He reached for his tea, but his hand trembled slightly, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. She had struck a nerve, and now was the moment to press. "And the scarf," she continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "Such a curious thing, smelling of lanolin, almost as if it came from a sheephand's pocket. You work with sheep, don't you, Mr. Gable?" Her eyes held his, kind but unyielding, and she saw the colour drain from his face. Tom's smile vanished, replaced by a wary stare. "You've been busy, miss," he said, his voice low, asking questions, poking. "About, what's an old lady like you care about a scarf?" His tone was defensive, but there was fear beneath it, and Miss Marple knew she was close. "Only the truth, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice steady. "The eggs are safe, you know, under the hay bales in the shed. A clever hiding place, but not clever enough. Did Mr. Finch promise you much to ruin Mrs. Harrow's chances?" Her words were a quiet thunderclap, and Tom's face paled, his hands gripping the chair. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his breath coming fast. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the fire's crackle. Then, like a dam breaking, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't my idea, Miss Finch. He said he'd clear my debt, give me a bit extra. Said no one'd get hurt, just a bit of mischief to tip the contest his way. I didn't want to, but I owed him, and he wouldn't let it go." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking, and Miss Marple watched, her expression kind but firm. She poured him more tea, her movements deliberate. "You've done right to tell me, Tom," she said, "but you must tell Constable Reed the truth. It's the only way to make amends." Her voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath it, and Tom nodded, his eyes red-rimmed. "I will, miss," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, truly." He rose, his cap clutched tightly, and left the cottage, his steps heavy. Miss Marple watched him go, her heart heavy but resolute. The truth was out, but the case was not yet closed. Finch's role needed confirmation, and the eggs must be returned to Mrs. Harrow. She rose, her stick tapping softly, and prepared to visit Constable Reed. The hay bale's secret. Tom's confession and Finch's ambition had unravelled the theft. But justice required one final step. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in every shadow, Miss Marple had pulled the thread, and the knot was undone. Chapter 10. The truth unravels. The late morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the bare branches of the village's ancient oaks, bathing Harrow Farm in a soft, forgiving light. The air, crisp with the promise of autumn, carried the distant hum of the harvest feast's preparations, where villagers bustled with final arrangements for the culinary contest. The milking shed, now a focal point of whispered speculation, stood silent under its padlock, its secrets no longer hidden from Miss Jane Marple. Her quiet confrontation with Tom Gable the previous afternoon had yielded a confession, unravelling the theft of Mrs. Harrow's speckled eggs as a scheme orchestrated by Mr. Finch, with Tom as his reluctant pawn. Yet the task remained to ensure justice was served, the eggs returned, and Finch's role exposed. Miss Marple, seated at her cottage's breakfast table, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, sipped her tea, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The truth was within reach, but it required careful handling. Like a delicate thread pulled from a tightly woven tapestry, Tom's admission had confirmed her. Suspicions: the eggs were hidden beneath the hay bales in the shed, the cow tracks were a deliberate ruse, and the scarf's lanolin scent tied Tom to the crime. His debt to Finch, a man desperate to secure the London contract by discrediting Mrs. Harrow, had driven him to betray his employer. Miss Marple recalled a case in Much Benham where a debt-ridden stable-boy had sabotaged a rival's carriage, his confession spilling forth under the weight of a single pointed question. Tom's remorse, she sensed, was genuine, but his words alone were not enough. She needed to guide Constable Reed to the eggs and ensure Finch faced the consequences, all without stirring the village into a frenzy that might let the true culprit slip away. She rose, her ebony stick tapping softly, and penned a note to Constable Reed, requesting his presence at Harrow Farm at noon. The message was brief, couched in her usual polite tone, but it carried an urgency that she trusted Reed would heed. She entrusted the note to her maid, Lily, who scurried off to the police station, her apron flapping. With that done, Miss Marple donned her sensible hat and made her way to the farm, her steps measured but purposeful. The village was alive with activity. Carts rumbled with produce, children darted with ribbons for the feast, and the hall's chimney puffed with the promise of roasting apples. But the farmyard was quieter, its usual bustle subdued by the shadow of the theft. Mrs. Harrow stood near the milking shed, her tweed coat buttoned against the chill, her face a storm of frustration. Jem, the farmhand, hovered nearby, polishing a bucket with unnecessary vigour, his eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrow," she said, her voice gentle. I trust the contest preparations are going well, despite the troubles. Mrs. Harrow's scowl softened slightly, though her voice remained sharp. Preparations, Miss Marple. What's the use without my eggs? The contest is in 2 hours, and I've half a mind to withdraw. Let Finch have his victory, he's been crowing loud enough. Her hands clenched, betraying the depth of her anger, and Miss Marple noted the strain in her eyes, a mix of pride and fear for her reputation. I'm sure it will all come right, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. The truth has a way of surfacing, you know. She excused herself and settled on her bench, her knitting bag at her side, though her needles remained untouched. Her thoughts were on Tom Gable, who had promised to confess to Reed, but whose nerve might falter under Finch's influence. She recalled a young maid in Upper Tilling, whose promise to confess a theft had wavered until a gentle nudge from Miss Marple had steadied her. Tom, she hoped, would hold to his word, but she was prepared to act if he did not. The farmyard stirred. As Constable Reed arrived, his lanky frame moving with a purposeful stride, he tipped his helmet to Miss Marple, his face a mix of determination and fatigue. "Got your note, Miss Marple," he said, his notebook in hand. "You've something to tell me about the eggs, I take it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "I believe so, Constable. But first, I suggest we fetch Mr. Gable. He may have information that will clarify matters." Her tone was mild, but her eyes held a glint that read, growing accustomed to her ways, recognized as significant. He nodded and sent Jem to find Tom, who was reportedly checking sheep in the eastern pasture. While they waited, Miss Marple recounted her findings, her voice low to avoid Mrs. Harrow's ears. "The eggs, I believe, are still in the shed, hidden beneath the hay bales," she said. "The cow tracks were a ruse, likely made by leading a cow through the shed after dark. The scarf, with its lanolin scent, points to someone who works with sheep, Mr. Gable, perhaps acting under pressure." She paused, letting Reed absorb the implications. "I've spoken with Tom, and he's promised to tell you the truth. But we must see the eggs returned before the contest begins." Reed's eyes widened, though he kept his voice steady. "Hidden in the shed. That's bold, Miss Marple. And you think Gable's behind it, with Finch pulling the strings?" He scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowed. "I'll have a look at those bales, but I need Gable's word to make it stick." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the shed. "Indeed, Constable, but tread carefully. Men under pressure can be unpredictable, like a cornered fox." She thought of a case in Chipping Cleghorn, where a cornered thief had bolted rather than confess, only to be caught by his own muddy boots. Reed, she trusted, would handle Tom with the right balance of firmness and tact. Tom appeared, his cap pulled low, his weathered jacket patched at the elbows. His quick smile was absent, replaced by a wary expression that deepened as he saw Miss Marple and Reed together. "Morning, Constable," he said, his voice tight. "Miss Marple said you wanted me." His eyes flicked to her, and she met them with a calm, unyielding gaze, her presence a quiet reminder of their conversation. Reed straightened, his tone official. "That's right, Tom. Miss Marple here thinks the eggs might still be on the farm. Got anything to say about that?" His question was direct, but there was a hint of encouragement, as if inviting Tom to unburden himself. Tom's shoulders slumped, and he glanced at Miss Marple, his face pale. "She's right, sir," he said, his voice low. "The eggs are in the shed, under the hay bales. I hid Em there, night before last. It was Mr. Finch's idea," he said, It'd give his eggs the edge in the contest, clear my debt to him too. I led a cow through the shed to make those tracks, dropped the scarf to point to a tramp. I didn't mean no harm, just wanted out from under Finch. His words tumbled out, his hands twisting his cap, and Miss Marple watched, her heart heavy but resolute. Reed's face hardened, though his voice remained calm. That's a serious matter, Tom. Let's get those eggs and have a word with Finch. You'll need to come clean, all of it. He turned to Miss Marple, his respect evident. You were right, miss. Let's open the shed. Mrs. Harrow, drawn by the commotion, approached, her eyes narrowing. What's this about the eggs? She demanded, her voice sharp. Miss Marple, with a gentle gesture, urged Reed to proceed, and he unlocked the shed, Jem trailing with a key. The door creaked open, admitting a shaft of sunlight that illuminated the hay bales in the corner. Reed and Tom moved the bales, revealing. The woven basket nestled in a hollow, its speckled eggs intact, cushioned by straw. Mrs. Harrow gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. My eggs, you found them. She turned to Tom, her fury rising. You, Gable, after all my trust. Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone soothing. He's confessed, Mrs. Harrow, she said, and he'll face the consequences. But your eggs are safe, and the contest can go on. Her words calmed the widow, who nodded, her anger giving way to relief. Reed took Tom by the arm, his grip firm but not harsh. You're coming with me, Tom. We'll need a statement, and then we'll see about Finch. He turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. I don't know how you did it, miss, but I'm grateful. You've saved the day. Miss Marple smiled, her expression modest. I only listened, Constable. The truth has a way of speaking for itself. As Reed led Tom away, she remained by the shed, her thoughts on Finch. His role was clear, but his denial would be fierce, and she trusted Reed to handle the confrontation. She recalled a case in Lower Barton, where a scheming merchant had been undone by his own overconfidence, his lies crumbling under a single witness's testimony. Finch, she suspected, would be no different. The farmyard buzzed as news of the eggs recovery spread, drawing villagers from the hall. Mrs. Bantry arrived, her shooting stick tapping the ground, her eyes wide with excitement. Jane, you've done it again. The eggs found in the shed. It's like one of Colonel Bantry's thrillers. She plopped onto the bench, fanning herself. Tell me everything. How did you know? Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly. It was the Dew, Dolly, and Tom's story. They didn't match, and people, you know, always leave traces. She said no more, but her friend's nod suggested she understood. The truth had unravelled, and the contest would proceed with Mrs. Harrow's eggs restored to their rightful place in St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in every shadow. Miss Marple had pulled the final thread, and the knot was undone. Chapter 11. Justice served. The noon sun hung high over St. Mary Mead, its warm rays bathing Harrow Farm in a glow that seemed to dispel the shadows of the past day's intrigue. The village abuzz with the news of the recovered speckled eggs, pulsed with a renewed energy as the Harvest Feast's culinary contest drew near. The milking shed, once a symbol of deceit, now stood as a testament to truth revealed. Its weathered oak door no longer a barrier to justice. Miss Jane Marple, having guided Constable Reed to the eggs hidden beneath the hay bales and secured Tom Gable's confession, stood quietly in the farmyard, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, her ebony stick resting lightly against her side. Her blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, surveyed the scene with a calm satisfaction, though her work was not yet complete. The final threads of the theft needed tying, and Mr. Finch, the mastermind behind the scheme, awaited his reckoning. The morning had unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed play. Tom Gable's confession, spurred by Miss Marple's gentle but relentless questioning, had laid bare the plot, the eggs hidden to discredit Mrs. Harrow, the cow tracks staged to suggest a chaotic theft, and the scarf dropped to point to an outsider. Tom's debt to Mr. Finch had been the lever, his loyalty to Mrs. Harrow sacrificed for the promise of relief. The eggs, now safely in Mrs. Harrow's hands, gleamed in their basket, their speckled shells a promise of triumph in the contest. But Finch's role, though clear to Miss Marple and Reed, required confrontation, a task she trusted the constable to handle with the firmness of youth tempered by her guidance. She recalled a case in Upper Tilling, where a scheming landlord's plot to ruin a rival had collapsed under the weight of a single witness's truth, and she sensed Finch's downfall would be no less swift. The farmyard bustled as villagers gathered, drawn by the news of the eggs' recovery. Mrs. Harrow, her stout frame radiating a mix of relief and indignation, clutched the basket as if it were a lifeline, her sharp tongue softened by gratitude. "I don't know how you did it, Miss Marple," she said, her voice gruff but sincere. "Those eggs are my pride, and you've saved my name." That gabble I'd have never thought him capable, but Finch, oh, I knew he was trouble. Her eyes flashed, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild but her mind alert. Mrs. Harrow's anger was justified, but justice, she knew, required more than emotion. It demanded proof and accountability. Constable Reed emerged from the farmhouse, where he had taken Tom's formal statement, his lanky frame moving with a newfound confidence. Tom followed, his cap in hand, his face pale but resolute, his earlier bravado replaced by a quiet shame. Reed approached Miss Marple, his notebook tucked under his arm. "It's all down, miss," he said, his voice low to avoid the crowd's ears. Tom's confessed everything: Finch's plan, the debt, the scarf, the lot. "I'm heading to Finch's farm now to have a word. Care to come along? Your insight's been worth its weight in gold." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Thank you, Constable, but I'll leave the questioning to you. An old lady's place is to listen, not to chase. But do ask Mr. Finch about his late-night meetings with Tom Polly at the Blue Boar. Mentioned them, you know." Her tone was gentle, but her suggestion was precise, a final nudge to ensure Reed's inquiry hit its mark. She thought of a young gardener in Chipping Cleghorn, whose employer's guilt had been exposed by a casual remark about his nightly walks, and trusted Reed to follow the trail. Reed nodded, tipping his helmet. "I'll do that, miss, and I'll let you know how it goes." He turned to Tom, his grip firm but not unkind. "You're staying with me, Tom, till we sort this out?" Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground, and the pair set off toward Finch's farm, a mile down the lane. Miss Marple watched them go, her thoughts on Finch, his ambition for the London contract, fueled by a struggling farm and a bitter rivalry with Mrs. Harrow, had driven him to this desperate act. She recalled a case in Lower Barton, where a merchant's greed had led him to bribe a clerk, only to be undone by the clerk's remorse. Finch, she suspected, would bluster but crumble under Reed's questioning, especially with Tom's testimony. The farmyard grew livelier as more villagers arrived, their voices a chorus of relief and curiosity. Mrs. Bantry, her shooting stick tapping the ground, swept in with her usual gusto, her eyes wide with excitement. "Jane," she exclaimed, plopping onto the bench beside Miss Marple, "you're a marvel. The eggs found, Tom confessing, and Finch in the thick of it's better than any novel. How did you know? And don't say it was just listening, because I know you've been up to something." She fanned herself with a handkerchief, her curiosity insatiable. Miss Marple's smile was serene, her knitting bag untouched. It was the do, dolly, and a few small things that didn't fit. People leave traces, you know, even when they try not to. She offered no more, but Mrs. Bantry's nod suggested she understood, or at least accepted, her friend's quiet. Brilliant. Miss Marple's mind, however, was on the contest, now mere hours away. With the eggs restored, Mrs. Harrow's chances were intact. But the villagers' harmony needed mending, strained by the theft's ripples. Mrs. Harrow, emboldened by the crowd, raised her voice. "The contest will go on," she declared, holding the basket aloft. "My eggs will show Finch and his lot what Harrow Farm can do, and I'll thank you all to spread the word this farm doesn't bow to thieves." The villagers cheered, their spirits lifted, and Miss Marple noted the shift in mood, a return to the villagers' usual camaraderie. She thought of a similar moment in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a stolen silver cup had been recovered before a fete, the village rallying around its return. Communities, she knew, healed quickly when truth prevailed. As the crowd dispersed, some to the hall, others to spread the news, Miss Marple remained, her gaze drifting to the shed. The hay bales, the scarf, the cow traxel had played there, part in unravelling the scheme, but it was Tom's confession that had sealed it. She wondered about his fate, a fine, perhaps, or a short stint in custody, tempered by his remorse and cooperation. She recalled a young poacher in her youth, whose honesty had earned him leniency, and hoped Tom would find a similar path. Finch, however, faced a sterner reckoning, his reputation tarnished and his contract hopes dashed. By mid-afternoon, Reed returned, his face flushed with triumph. He sought out Miss Marple, who had moved to a quieter corner of the farmyard, her bench now shaded by a gnarled apple tree. "It's done, miss," he said, his voice low but eager. Finch tried to deny it, at first blustered about his good name, swore Tom was lying. But when I mentioned those late-night meetings and Tom's statement, he folded. Admitted he paid Tom to hide the eggs, said it was just a prank to give his hens a chance. Prank, my foot. He's coming with me to the station to make a statement. And I'll see he's charged conspiracy at least. His eyes shone with gratitude. "Couldn't have done it without you, Miss Marple. You've a knack for seeing what others miss." Miss Marple's smile was modest, her eyes crinkling. "You're very kind, Constable, but it was your diligence that brought it home. I only pointed the way." She paused, her tone gentle. "And Tom, he'll face a penalty, I suppose." Reed nodded, his expression softening. "A fine, likely, and some community work. He's young, and he came clean. The magistrate'll go easy, I reckon, especially with Mrs. Harrow's eggs back." He tipped his helmet and moved off to address the crowd, his voice carrying the news of Finch's confession. The villagers gasped, then cheered, their faith in justice restored. Miss Marple rose, her stick tapping softly, and made her way to the village hall, where the contest was about to begin. The hall was a riot of colour, and scent tables groaned, with pies, tarts, and custards, their makers hovering with pride. Mrs. Harrow, her eggs, now the centrepiece of her entry, a golden soufflé, stood tall, her face radiant. The judges, including Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Price, sampled each dish, their murmurs punctuated by nods and smiles. Miss Marple slipped into a seat near the back, her presence unnoticed amid the excitement, and watched as Mrs. Harrows softly drew gasps of admiration. The eggs' rich yolks, she knew, had worked their magic, and when the judges announced Mrs. Harrow as the winner, the hall erupted in applause. Mrs. Harrow, accepting the ribbon, sought out Miss Marple's eyes and gave a nod of gratitude. Rare gesture from the prickly widow, Miss Marple returned it, her heart light. The London contract was hers, and the village's honour was intact. She thought of a similar triumph in Little Wishwood, where a recovered brooch had saved a seamstress's livelihood, and knew that small victories could mend great rifts as the feast began. With music and laughter filling the hall, Miss Marple slipped away, her stick tapping a quiet rhythm on the cobbled lane. The village was at peace, its secrets laid bare, and justice had been served with the efficiency of a well-tended garden. She recalled a young clerk in her youth whose theft had been forgiven after restitution, and hoped Tom would find his way back to the village's good graces. Finch, however, would bear the weight of his ambition. A lesson in the folly of greed. At her cottage she paused at the gate, the evening air cool against her cheeks. The stars were emerging, their light a promise of clarity. Justice, she knew, was not always loud or swift, but in St. Mary Mead, where every shadow held a story, Miss Marple had ensured it prevailed, one careful thread at a time. Chapter 12. A quiet evening. The evening stars glimmered above St. Mary Mead, their soft light casting a serene glow over the village's thatched roofs and winding lanes. The harvest feast, now in full swing at the village hall, filled the air, with the distant strains of a fiddle and the warm hum of laughter, a celebration undimmed by the recent drama of the stolen eggs. Harrow Farm, its milking shed no longer a nexus of suspicion, lay quiet under the moonlight, its fields stretching into the darkness like a tranquil sea. Miss Jane Marple, having slipped away from the festivities, sat by her cottage's hearth, the fire's gentle crackle a soothing counterpoint to the day's triumphs. Her lavender shawl rested over her shoulders, and her knitting needles moved, with a steady rhythm, crafting a shawl for her niece Florence. Yet her mind, ever alert behind her mild blue eyes, was weaving the final threads of the case that had unravelled the theft of Mrs. Harrow's speckled eggs. The day had been one of quiet victory. Tom Gable's confession, spurred by her gentle probing, had exposed the scheme, the eggs hidden beneath the hay bales to discredit Mrs. Harrow, the cow tracks staged to suggest a haphazard theft, and the scarf dropped to point to an outsider. Mr. Finch's role as the mastermind, driven by his ambition for the London contract, had been confirmed when he crumbled under Constable Reed's questioning, his bluster giving way to a grudging admission. The eggs, restored to Mrs. Harrow, had secured her triumph in the culinary contest, her golden soufflé earning the judge's praise and the coveted contract. Tom faced a fine and community work, his remorse earning him leniency, while Finch's reputation lay in tatters, his farm's future uncertain. Miss Marple, her role in the affair known only to a few, felt the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. Though her thoughts lingered on the human frailties that had woven the crime, she sipped her chamomile tea, its warmth spreading through her, and reflected on the villagers' resilience. St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, was a place where secrets simmered, yet its heart beat with a stubborn goodness. She recalled a similar case in Lower Barton, where a stolen silver tray had been recovered before a wedding, the village rallying to forgive the repentant thief. Tom Gable, she hoped, would find his place again, his youth and honesty outweighing. His misstep, Finch, however, was another matter. His pride, like that of a pompous merchant she'd known in her youth, had been his undoing, and the village would not soon forget his deceit. The fire popped, sending a spark onto the hearth, and Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the night sky stretched vast and clear. The case had begun with small clues: the undisturbed duel, the lanolin-scented scarf, the misaligned hay bale each, a thread in a tapestry she had patiently unravelled. Her methods, so unlike the brash heroics of her nephew Raymond's detective novels, relied on observation and understanding, the quiet art of seeing what others overlooked. She thought of Tom's nervous smile, Jem's ale-fueled slip, and Finch's overconfident boasts, each a telltale sign of human nature's predictable flaws. People, she knew, were much like her garden roses, beautiful in their complexity, but prone to thorns when mishandled. A knock at the door broke her reverie. She rose, her ebony stick tapping softly, and opened it to find Constable Reed, his lanky frame silhouetted against the moonlight. His helmet was tucked under his arm, and his face, though tired, bore a grin of triumph. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm. "Didn't want to disturb you, but I thought you'd like to know how it wrapped up." Finch has made a full statement, admitted to paying Tom to hide the eggs, said it was to level the playing field. He's facing a fine and a public reprimand, maybe more if Mrs. Harrow presses charges. Tom's penalty is set a month's work at the churchyard, and he's to pay a small fine. He's grateful, miss, and so am I, you saw. What we all missed. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "You're too kind, Constable. I only noticed what was there to see the do. The scarf, a few words out of place. You did the real work, bringing it to light." Her tone was modest, but Reed's nod suggested he understood her role, even if he couldn't quite fathom her. Methods? She invited him in, offering tea, but he declined, citing a need to return to the feast. Double quotes. "Mrs. Harrow's the talk of the hall," he said, lingering at the door. "Her soufflé swung her that London contract, and she's singing your praises, though she's not one for sentiment." "How'd you know, miss? About the hay bales, I mean, and Tom's part in it." His curiosity was genuine, a young man eager to learn from an unexpected mentor. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze drifting to the fire. "It's the small things, Constable. The dew told me no one fled the farm, the scarf pointed to sheep, and Tom's story didn't hold when pressed. People are like my garden, you see, full of patterns, if you know where to look," she offered. No more, but Reed's smile widened, as if glimpsing the depth beneath her simplicity. He tipped his helmet and left, his lantern bobbing down the lane. Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her knitting resumed, and let her thoughts wander. The case had been a small one, in the grand scheme a clutch of eggs. A village contest, but its ripples had touched the heart of St. Mary Mead. Tom's remorse, she believed, would guide him back to the village's fold, much like a wayward lamb returned to the flock. Finch, however, would bear the weight of his ambition, his name whispered in the pub with disapproval. She recalled a similar figure in Much Benham, a merchant whose greed had cost him his standing, his shop shunned, until he left. Villagers, she knew, had long memories, but they also had room for redemption. The fire burned low, its embers glowing softly, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the broader canvas of human nature. The theft had been born of desperation and pride, twin forces that drove even good men to folly. Tom's debt had made him vulnerable, Finch's rivalry had made him ruthless, And the eggs, those fragile symbols of prestige, had been the spark. She thought of a young curate in her youth, whose theft of a collection plate had been driven by a sick mother's needs, his confession easing his soul. Tom's case was not so different, and she hoped the village would see it, offering him a chance to make amends. Outside, the feast's music grew fainter, the village settling into the quiet of a night well spent. Miss Marple rose, her stick, tapping softly, and moved to the window, where the stars shone with a clarity that matched her thoughts. The case had been solved, not with grand gestures, but with patience, a careful piecing together of clues that others overlooked. The dew's testimony, the scarf scent, the hay bale's secret toll had played their part, but it was her understanding of people, their motives and missteps, that had brought the truth to light. She recalled a case in Chipping Cleghorn, where a stolen locket had been found through a maid's nervous glance, and knew that human nature was her true guide. She returned to her chair, her knitting resumed, and considered the village's future. The harvest feast would be remembered for Mrs. Harrow's triumph, the eggs' recovery, and the quiet justice that had prevailed. Tom, she trusted, would work his penance and find his place again, perhaps with a wiser heart. Finch, stripped of his contract and his pride, would face the village's judgment, a lesson in the cost of envy. She thought of Mrs. Harrow, her soufflé golden victory, and smiled at the thought of her eggs reaching London's tables, a small triumph. St. Mary Mead, the clock on the mantel chimed 10, its soft notes a reminder of the hour. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her shawl nearly complete, and rose to bank the fire. The village was at peace, its secrets laid bare, and she felt the quiet contentment of a task well done. She recalled a young girl in her youth, whose theft of a ribbon had been forgiven after a tearful apology, and knew that St. Mary Mead, for all its flaws, was a place of second chances. The eggs, the scarf, the cow traxel were now part of the village's lore, a tale to be told over winter fires as she prepared for bed. Her cottage filled with the scent of chamomile and wood smoke, Miss Marple paused at the window, her gaze on the stars. "Such a fuss over eggs," she murmured, her voice soft but amused. Yet she knew that even the smallest theft could unravel the deepest truths, and in St. Mary Mead, where every shadow held a story, she was always ready to tug the thread. The fire died to embers, the night grew still, and Miss Marple, with a final glance at the sky, retired, her mind at rest but ever watchful for the next puzzle.